They didn't just lie about a religion, they buried a revelation. For decades, you were shown smoke, but never the fire. You were told what to fear, but never what to read. A carefully crafted illusion replaced the truth, repeated so many times that even truth itself seemed like a stranger. They handed you a version of Islam so twisted, so distant from its origin, that even those born into it began to doubt. But what if I told you that the very thing you were warned against holds the one truth powerful enough to break every chain inside you? What if the book they silenced is the one voice your soul has been waiting to hear? This isn't just about religion. This is about deception on a global scale. A truth too dangerous for tyrants, too liberating for manipulators, too clear for the world to control. A book that stood unshaken while kingdoms rose and fell. It didn't come to entertain, it came to awaken. It spoke when no one else dared. It gave rights before revolutions. It uplifted women before constitutions. It liberated minds before the world even knew what freedom meant. And all this time they told you it was something to fear. They showed you violence, but never verses. They showed you faces of rage, but never the calm of prayer. They painted a religion with the strokes of ignorance and hatred, while the Quran sat untouched, unread, and undefeated. It begins with mercy, ends with guidance, and fills every line in between with clarity, power, and purpose. And yet, they never let you hear it for yourself. This is not just another video. This is a challenge to everything you thought you knew. Because once the Quran speaks, it doesn't just inform, it exposes. It doesn't ask for belief, it demands reflection. And once you hear it with your heart open, the lies no longer survive. So don't blink, don't scroll, because what's coming next might just be the moment that changes everything. For as long as many can remember, Islam was painted as the villain in a story most people never bothered to read. It was the background noise in headlines filled with fear, the foreign language shouted in chaos on news reports, the misunderstood religion whispered about in classrooms and coffee shops. People were told to be cautious, to be suspicious, to raise an eyebrow whenever the word Muslim was mentioned. But here's the truth. They were never taught to understand it. They were taught to fear it. The world didn't reject Islam because it read the Quran and disagreed. The world rejected it because it never read the Quran at all. What was feared wasn't faith, it was unfamiliarity. And what grew out of that unfamiliarity was a carefully crafted image made up of misquotes, half-truths, and outright lies. Islam was never the enemy, but ignorance, repeated and amplified, became louder than truth. They told people Islam was harsh, yet never mentioned its mercy. They said Muslims were extreme, but ignored the millions living in humility and peace. They showed anger, fire, and chaos, but never the quiet of prayer, the discipline of fasting, the beauty of brotherhood, the dignity in modesty. And slowly, generation after generation, the lie became a legacy. People inherited fear. They passed it down without ever questioning the source. It was easier to stay afraid than to open a book and read for themselves. But the lie wasn't just external. It crept into the hearts of even some Muslims who began to question their own faith through the lens of someone else's misunderstanding. The narrative became so loud, so constant, that it began to overshadow the essence of Islam itself. That's how powerful deception can be. Not just to change what others see, but to make you doubt what you already have. But truth has a strange way of surviving. It waits patiently. It doesn't need to scream. It only needs to be seen. And when anyone finally decides to peel back the layers, to question the noise, and to actually open the Quran, not to debate, but to understand, they begin to see that the real enemy was never Islam. It was the wall built around it, brick by brick, lie by lie, generation after generation. The world never gave the Quran a fair chance. It gave the microphone to anger, the camera to chaos, and the headlines to violence. When people turned on their TVs, They didn't see verses of mercy or stories of patience. They saw fire, destruction, and panic. And over time, that's all they began to associate with Islam. The media didn't show the Quran, it showed bombs. It didn't show prayer, it showed protests. It didn't quote the verses that speak about kindness to neighbors, justice for all, or protection of life. It cherry-picked words, stripped them of context, and pasted them beside images of destruction. The goal was never to inform, the goal was to control perception. And they succeeded. For a time, what was deliberately hidden from the public was the depth, beauty, and logic of the Quran. They're still deliberately hidden from the public was the depth, beauty, and logic of the Quran. People didn't see the book that inspired generations to seek knowledge, because if people had really heard what the Quran said, they would have started to question everything they had been told. They would have realized that the very book they were taught to fear is the same book that champions justice, demands humility, and uplifts the human spirit in ways no headline ever could. But fear sells. Misrepresentation spreads faster than truth, and so the camera kept rolling, not on the people studying the Quran in libraries or the children reciting its words with love, but on the flashpoints that made the world flinch. That's how they kept the truth locked away, not by disproving it, but by never letting it speak. And in that silence, a billion voices were reduced to a single distorted image, while the book that could have cleared everything up was quietly ignored. When the Quran is finally read, not through the filter of media bias, not through someone else's twisted translation, but with sincerity and an open heart, it doesn't whisper, it roars. It doesn't come to entertain, it comes to awaken. And for those who have the courage to approach it with honesty, what they discover is not a book of terror, but a force of truth, so direct, so undeniable, that it leaves no room for the lies they once believed. The Quran doesn't need to defend itself. It just needs to be heard. And when it is, it exposes everything that was hidden under decades of fear, misunderstanding, and deliberate distortion. And people expect complexity, contradiction, and confusion when they open its pages. Instead, they find clarity. They find verses that speak to the soul in a language beyond culture, beyond time. They find that the Quran doesn't call people to blind obedience, it calls them to reflection. It doesn't suppress intellect, it demands that you think. Again and again it says, do you not reflect? Do you not reason? And when that invitation is accepted, something powerful happens. The veil starts to lift, the doubts begin to crumble, the version of Islam the world told you to fear starts to look nothing like the faith you're actually reading about. The Quran doesn't just correct the lies, it exposes the motives behind them. It speaks of those who twist truth knowingly, those who create division for power, those who fear the light because it threatens their control. It doesn't shy away from naming injustice, whether it comes from a throne or a pulpit. It calls out corruption, arrogance, and oppression without apology. And that's what makes it dangerous, not to the common person, but to the systems that rely on ignorance to survive. Because once you read it for yourself, you start to see through the noise. You start to realize the world didn't fear Islam because it was violent. They feared it because it was true. And truth, when it arrives, doesn't ask permission. It breaks the chains. It clears the smoke. It doesn't whisper. It roars. They said Islam oppresses women. They said it silences freedom, promotes violence, and crushes justice. They repeated these lies so often that even those who never read a single verse believed them. But when you open the Quran for yourself, when you strip away the noise and let the words speak without distortion, everything begins to look different. the narrative you were handed starts to collapse. Because the truth is, long before the world spoke of human rights, the Quran had already established them. Long before society spoke of protecting women, Islam had already honored them. The same book they said oppressed women is the one that gave them rights to inheritance, education, ownership, and dignity in an age when they were buried alive for being born girls. They said Islam promotes violence, but the Quran repeatedly calls to peace, to restraint, to forgiveness. It teaches that even in the face of conflict, justice must prevail, that even the enemy is not to be hated blindly, and that the soul of one innocent human being is as valuable as all of mankind. These aren't opinions or modern reinterpretations. These are direct words, preserved for over 14 centuries, waiting for anyone to read them without bias. And yet, they were ignored, twisted, weaponized. They said Islam silences freedom, but the Quran calls humanity to liberation. From slavery to idols, from submission to power, from the chains of arrogance and blind following. It commands truth, even if it's against your own self. It uplifts the poor, defends the orphan, and stands beside the oppressed, regardless of their background. It doesn't teach people to follow blindly. It asks them to question, to reflect, to use reason, to seek knowledge. The same book that's been labeled as dangerous is the one that planted the seeds of civilization, of science, of law, of spiritual awakening. So why the lies? Because the truth threatens systems that benefit from ignorance. A book that empowers the weak and humbles the powerful is not welcome in a world driven by greed and control. But the Quran is not afraid. It doesn't hide. It stands firm. And when it's finally heard, not misquoted, not misused, but heard, the truth speaks louder than all the lies ever told. For many, Islam was something to fear until they picked up the Quran themselves. It didn't happen in a debate hall or through a shouting match. It didn't happen because someone forced them to believe. It happened in the quiet moments, when curiosity overcame fear and sincerity overcame prejudice. They approached the Quran not as scholars or critics, but as human beings, tired of hearing conflicting stories and wanting to know the truth for themselves. And in that honest pursuit, they found something unexpected. The words didn't match the headlines. The tone didn't match the fear. The message didn't echo the hate they had been warned about. Instead, it calmed them. It spoke to them. It challenged them, not to fight, but to think. They expected judgment. They found mercy. They expected harshness. They found wisdom. They expected war. They found peace. And the more they read, the more the walls inside them began to fall. Because the Quran wasn't calling them to a culture or a nation. It was calling them to the Creator of all. It didn't ask them to change their name, their skin, or their language. It asked them to change the condition of their heart. And that hit deeper than any ideology ever could. Suddenly, verses started making sense in ways no philosophy or motivational quote ever did. They read about patience and recognized their own struggles. They read about hardship and were reminded of the battles they never spoke about. They read about forgiveness and saw their own scars begin to heal. The Quran didn't try to impress them. It spoke truth. And truth doesn't need decoration. That's what made it different. That's what made it powerful. Because when you've been living in a world of noise, of half-truths and empty slogans, hearing something real cuts straight through the fog. The fear that once kept them away turned into fascination. And that fascination, and once it is, everything else begins to fall apart. That's what the Quran did. It didn't scream louder than the lies. It simply stood still and waited to be open. It didn't drag its feet and scream louder than the lies. It simply stood still and waited to be open. Because the Quran isn't in how loudly it's defended. It's in how clearly it speaks. For centuries, people tried to bury it under propaganda, politics, and fear. They tried to reduce it to a stereotype, a headline, a threat. But the Quran was never built on public opinion. It doesn't bend to trends. It doesn't shift with time. It is truth in its purest form. What people don't realize is that the Quran was never a book that needed saving. It was always the world that needed saving from the lies built in its absence. You can debate beliefs all day, but truth doesn't compete. It doesn't panic when it's challenged. It doesn't rely on popularity to prove its worth. It simply exists, unchanged, undeniable, waiting for hearts ready to receive it. And that's why Islam spreads, not through force, but through awakening. Not because it promises comfort, but because it delivers clarity. Once the fog is lifted, once the false labels are peeled away, what remains is something powerful, raw, and magnetic. And that's what scared those who built their power on keeping others in the dark. The Quran doesn't cater to ego or sugarcoat reality. It confronts the soul. It asks questions no one else dares to ask. It challenges the illusion of control. It breaks the illusion of self-sufficiency. And in doing so, it exposes everything, not just the lies about Islam, but the lies we tell ourselves about life, purpose, power, and truth. And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. That's the kind of truth the Quran brings. It doesn't force itself on anyone, but once it enters the heart, it rearranges everything. It's not just a book. It's a light. And light doesn't argue with darkness. It simply shows up, and darkness disappears. They lied. For years, they lied about the faith, about the people, about the book. They built walls of fear and painted Islam with